Hi, I'm Damon Centola. I want to share with you a few ideas from my new book, Change, on how tipping points work and how social network strategies can help to trigger tipping points in society. So, the way we typically start is by looking at a large scale social network and all its interconnected patterns. And typically, what we do is pick out key people. So, there are some people who are highly connected and they tend to be located in the center of the network. And then people who are less connected who are located out in the periphery. Now, one of the key sort of theories of social change that's been around for a very long time has been that tipping points are typically triggered by highly connected people, often referred to as influencers. So, when that person adopts, their disproportionate social connectedness allows them to trigger lots of people, which then gives rise to sort of a snowball effect that reaches the rest of society. What's so interesting is that that theory of social change has been around for three-quarters of a century, but there's never been good enough data to test it. So in the last couple of years, what we started to do was to test this theory, and what we found is something interesting. When we look at data on social change, for example, mobilization around Arab Spring, but also lots of other kinds of social change dynamics, we tend to see social change taking hold in the periphery of the network and then spreading not to the center, but actually around the structure of the periphery and only reaching the center at the end. So this represents a really important scientific puzzle in our theory of social change and tipping points, which is our best ideas from the last century tell us that things start in the center and spread outward. But all of the data from the last decade tells us that real social changes tend to spread from the periphery, which is where tipping points are triggered, and then only reach the center at the end. So what I want to suggest is that what goes wrong here is our theory of networks. That basically, when we look at these two networks, we intuitively think the network on the left is going to be our sort of trigger point for initiating large-scale change. But actually, it's the network on the right, and this is what I'm going to talk to you about briefly today. The network on the right that's able to really effectively trigger a growth of a critical mass, which ultimately triggers society-wide tipping points. And so what goes wrong here in our intuitions, why we pick out the network on the left rather than the network on the right, is we're basing our ideas on epidemiology, that is to say, the science of viral spreading. And this is really what's referred to as simple contagions, the idea that all that's required for contagion to spread is contact. So if someone has COVID-19, they come into contact with a lot of people, they're responsible for an outbreak or an epidemic. But it's different when we think about social thinking, where people are changing their ideas and beliefs as a result of their social context. In this case, these dynamics are complex contagions, which means people really rely on the social reinforcement from the people around us, and networks interact in complex ways, making the clustered structures and the peripheral structures I showed you on the right actually much more effective for spreading complex contagions than the people who are highly connected in the center of the network. So let's talk about this myth of the influencer. So we have this idea of a connected network, the people in the middle and the people in the periphery. And what goes on here for a simple contagion is that someone who's highly connected in the middle of the network can easily find out about a new idea. And if that person adopts the idea, then they can spread it to lots of people. And again, this is consistent with the viral model. So from the perspective of simple contagions, the network on the left has clear advantages of the network on the right. But here's the thing about complex contagions. Often when we're thinking about adopting a new behavior or an idea or an innovation that's contentious, it's not just that we need to be convinced to adopt it, it's that we need to be convinced that it's legitimate in our social circle. So think about someone who's highly connected. Now, their adoption behavior is highly public and highly commented on. So if they adopt an innovation, actually all of those ties aren't necessarily outgoing ties. They're really incoming ties. These are people who are judging them based on what they do. And this is one reason why people who are highly connected can actually be the last people to adopt an innovation rather than the earlier people. Whereas the network on the right, people have more modest contexts, and those contexts are clustered, which allows for social reinforcement, which can more easily grow a critical mass of support for an innovation. And as a result of this, the network on the right is a place where innovation can more easily take off. So now let's think about this in terms of how to target tipping points. So one of the classic ideas people think about today is if you want to grow a tipping point, find an influencer and convince them. The idea is that although they may be more reluctant to adopt, you can nevertheless incentivize them and therefore presumably trigger a cascade. So let's see how this would work for a viral video or a simple contagion. You get that first highly connected person to adopt. They then activate all the people they're connected to and the people they're connected to, and you get this sort of viral diffusion. This seems like it could work in lots of cases. And I think when we talk about complex contagions, a lot of people say, well, we've already got viral strategies in place. So what's the harm of just going ahead with our viral strategy? Here's the thing. The failure of viral strategies isn't just that they won't work when it comes to spreading complex contagions. It's that if there are social norms at stake and issues of legitimacy, then the viral approach can actually lead to a backfire. One of the best cases and examples of this is Google Glass, which was this exciting, memorable, very sticky product product. And the strategy was to use elite influencers to sort of initiate a tipping point in people's desire to have the Google Glass technology. Of course, it was sort of a cyborg technology where you could, you know, browse the web while you were talking to people and then surveil and record the visual environment. But that triggered a real backlash because the idea that you would browse the web while you're talking to someone violated norms about contact. And the idea that you could record the visual environment without people knowing violated norms about privacy. And so instead of the influencers becoming the people that everyone aspired to be like, instead there was a strong social reaction where the product and the influencers associated were rejected and referred to as glass holes. And this not only led to the shutdown of the product, but actually damaged Google's overall reputation. And so the question is, if you're in one of these situations where social norms are at stake, where these green nodes aren't just passive actors waiting to adopt, like be infected with COVID-19, but actually people with beliefs and norms that are sort of considering the different options available to them, then if you initiate an influencer, well, that person may convince one or two people, but those people they're trying to convince are also surrounded by countervailing influences from non-adopters, and the social norms sort of prevent this idea from taking hold. But if you take the same network with the same level of resistance and instead target this social cluster out here in the periphery, something amazing happens. Social reinforcement doesn't just try to spread everywhere at once. Instead, what happens is these clusters tend to generate support through wide bridges, which cascade through the periphery of the network. And this is where critical mass happens. You get a large enough group in the periphery that then it triggers a tipping point that then spreads to the center of the network and reaches everybody else. And so what this means for tipping points is that the sort of the logic of the growth of Black Lives Matter is very similar to the logic of the spread of support for same-sex marriage, which is similar to the logic of the spread of Twitter. Basically, in all these cases, you have these dynamics where there's slow initial growth at first, then there's sort of some critical elbow where growth accelerates, and then past that point, it reaches the vast majority of the population. And so historically, what we've done is describe these tipping points in terms of the adopters and say, well, first you have the early adopters, you need to reach them, then you get regular people, then you get the laggards. The point I want to impress upon you is that this characterization of this diffusion curve is a post hoc labeling of different parts of the curve, but there's zero social science to suggest that what's actually happening in one of these curves is that there are different types of people. What's really going on here, in fact, is these are different parts of the social network. What's going on during the early growth phase is that people who adopt early are actually people who are in the structured periphery. And the reason it's spreading slowly is because it's cascading through wide bridges. Then, when it reaches a critical mass, that's when there is enough reinforcement to carry this idea through the center of the network and then ultimately reach the unstructured periphery. So, in terms of the diagram I showed you before, what this means is when the innovation takes hold in the periphery, now it's spreading in a way that appears to be slow compared to the viral model. But what's really going on is it's building a critical mass of support so that now it can sort of convince lots of different people, even highly connected people, to adopt. And that's when acceleration happens in the growth curve. And so this is true for the spread of solar panels. These are all topics I discuss in the book. For spread of changes in race and gender bias in medicine, for changes in polarization online, for the growth of Me Too, and even for the acceptance of face masks and vaccination. And so what this means is when we look at these kinds of networks, although the network on the left is tempting to think of as a target for growing a critical mass that can trigger a tipping point, it's actually a network on the right where we're going to see the greatest effects. So all of this is described in much more detail in my recent book, and I look forward to taking your questions. Thanks very much.